Composer Mark Camphouse, so great to have you with us today. Honored to have this opportunity to have you speak on behalf of the piece that you composed, A Movement for Rosa. I have a couple of questions for you here right off the bat that I'm just itching to ask. Okay, one is if you could go through the process and inspiration for A Movement for Rosa.
Thank you, Tim. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to having this chat for some time. I can remember very, very clearly finishing breakfast with my wife. It was a Sunday morning. We were reading the Sunday paper, and the cover story of the magazine for the Roanoke Times, this is when we were in Virginia, was a cover story, a feature story about Mrs. Parks. And I, of course, knew about Mrs. Parks and how her single act of courage really transformed race relations in America and equality. But it just dawned on me when I saw her picture on the cover that no important musical composition has ever been written about her patriotism, about her that single act of courage that changed America. And I knew right then and there I wanted to do it. Well, a day or so later, it was really kind of eerie. Mallory Thompson called. And at that time, Mallory was the director of bands at University of South Florida in Tampa. And she explained to me that the Florida Bandmasters Association was having, they came through with some money, and they wanted to commission a major composer to write a work honoring someone. And she said, Mark, we've got it down to you and Frank DeKelly. And she said, if we select you, if you write a programmatic piece, do you know what it might be about? And I explained to her that I was very, very keen about writing a work honoring Rosa Parks. And she said, done, you've got it. Great idea. End of story. So that's how it came about. The money for the commission at that time was $5,000. This was 1992. That was a good hunk of change in 1992. And it came about that the monies were gathered through late fees. High school, middle school band directors who did not pay their fees on time. And this is where the money came from. And it added up to $5K. So I always encourage band directors to be late with their payments because it will help composers. So that's where the idea came from.
That's really terrific. One of the things that I've noticed, this is now the second time that I've conducted the piece. The first time was with the Wheaton College Band up in the Chicagoland area, and this is the second time. And both times, I've read it differently. I felt it differently.
Good. That's to be encouraged. As a composer, I like when conductors say that.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that, you go through different stages of your life. And,
Sure.
I'm at a different stage now than I was then. One of the
Mhm.
things that I notice now, this time through, is that I really feel her life story throughout the piece. Was that the intention, was to have it be kind of a beginning of her life and working it through? What were some of the components that went into that?
Well, the first section is primarily about her early years. That takes us from her birth in 1913 to her marriage to Raymond Parks in 1932. The second part of the piece really is about the racial strife, the energy, the tension at that time in the South. Yeah. And the music is very intense. It's agitated. And the third concluding section of the work is quite serene. So I think you might be interested in this as a conductor. Do you have a score with you?
Yes.
Check out 93, measure 93. And I would like for the listeners to wait for this as well. You see the quarter note, half note, eighth, half, that recurring bum.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Bum, bum.
Yes.
Right. This didn't make it into the program note, but I wish it did. I remember growing up in Chicago, hearing lots of televised and sometimes live, actually seeing African-American people protesting on the streets, they said, freedom, freedom now, chanting, freedom, freedom now. And so I wanted it to be slow enough to where it could be enunciated. But that's what that stands for.
I
Remembering.
didn't know that. I did not know that. That's
most people don't until they hear that from the composer.
yeah.
I wish it got into the program note and the published score, but yeah, that's what it's about. Freedom.
Wow.
That's what the whole piece is about when you think about it.
Well, that's amazing. I really didn't know that. Now, okay, so here's another spot that caught me off guard the very first time I conducted it. And as a younger conductor, the ending, it doesn't end with hope.
I think I'm very pleased the way I ended the piece. You know, Mrs. Parks is such a lovely person, so gentle, so petite. It would have been very tempting to put a warm and fuzzy Hollywood ending on the piece because she was such a beautiful person, a very strong person, very courageous, a great American patriot. But I thought it was more important to remind the listeners of racism's lingering presence in contemporary 21st century American society.
Right.
And that's why it ends dark, very intentionally.
Yeah.
The opening here's again, it's an orchestrational thing. The piece celebrates how one person from a very ordinary background can make a difference, can be transformative for our country. And so I didn't want the entire ensemble to play the opening theme. I didn't want a certain section in the group to play it. It had to be one person playing one instrument to show that one person can still make a difference today. So that's what it's about. And then the one person becomes two people. You have that conversation, that little dialogue with bassoon and alto sax, right? And then the brass choir comes in. When the brass choir enters, I usually like to use the analogy of maybe this is a Sunday morning, kind of a steamy Sunday morning in rural Alabama, and there's steam coming off of the river, and in the distance, you hear a gospel choir in a church, very, very faintly in the distance, and then as you get closer, but that's what the brass chorale is about there.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite spots.
The place where the "We shall overcome" hymn is stated by solo French horn, and I think it's colored with some flute harmony and of course chimes also, getting back to that church from the opening brass chorale, you know. Here again, the orchestration is very, very lean. There's not a whole lot happening here. We want the spotlight to be on the French horn and the melody that most Americans know. So I think that was, it's my favorite part in the piece, actually. I also think, you know, we're influenced by other composers. I guess I was probably thinking, well, who uses solo horn so effectively? And I'm thinking of the opening of the finale of Firebird by Stravinsky, with that wonderful French horn solo that just kind of comes out of nowhere. So it's not plagiarism on my part, but we are all influenced by what comes before us. Early Beethoven sounds a lot like late Mozart. Early Brahms sounds a lot like late Beethoven. Early Stravinsky sounds an awful lot like late Rimsky-Korsakov. And John Williams sounds about like anybody, like everybody, I should say. I adore John Williams' film music. Very different than his concert music, I might add.
There's some orchestration components in Rosa that are brilliant. They just work. How do you come up with the orchestration of the ideas that you have?
If I have a strong suit, it's probably orchestration. I love it. You're painting with sound, sometimes deep red, sometimes pastels, but orchestration is maybe it's at once the most tedious part, but also one of the most enjoyable parts too. I might agonize, maybe orchestrate 1 or 2 bars a day in a piece, because it takes a while, because you need to get it just right. You can't slop through orchestration. Every note has to have a distinct personality and color that will stand apart, sometimes very boldly, very dramatically, and at other times it needs to blend and really mesh with the sounds. So, but orchestration, thank you for noticing that. That means a lot. One of my favorite stories, someone was listening to Elegy, a piece that was commissioned by the United States Marine Band. And they said, Mark, when I first heard this, I thought it was a symphony orchestra. And that was really a compliment to me, because I love orchestral music, but I love symphonic bands as well. But sometimes you want the richness that the strings can give you, and how to replicate that with a symphonic band is not easy. It's much, in my opinion, it's much more difficult to orchestrate for wind band than it is for symphony orchestra, because the wind band does not have the homogeneous body of strings that the orchestra does. But to have someone say, gee, that sounds so orchestral, that's what I attempt to do very, very often in my writing. The symphonic band has a wind ensemble inherent in it. It has brass quintet, it has percussion ensemble, it has woodwind quintet, it has saxophone quartet. All of these different chamber groups can emerge from the tutti, or the full sound of the group. And I like to exploit those chamber ensembles that are found in the symphonic band as well.
There is so much insight in that last segment that, with your permission, I'm going to borrow 100% of it to share with my students. They need to hear that.
Please do. I will always be a teacher and mentor till my last breath. And if that can help a young composer or a young conductor, use it. Please do. My wife and I spent the better part of a day with Mrs. Parks in April of 1993, in all places, Boise, Idaho. Boise State University had her campus to oversee the establishment of a new African-American scholarship fund. And then I got to sit next, my wife was on that trip with me. My wife got to sit next to me on the left. Mrs. Parks was seated right next to me on the right. And as we were sitting down, I whispered, I leaned over to Libby, my wife. I said, dear, what do I do if she doesn't like it? Because she had never heard the piece. And I turned and looked about 2 or 3 minutes into the piece. I said, well, I better see what she's doing if she, and there were tears, the good kind of tears, you know? So she was very emotionally moved by the piece. And that of course meant the world to me. You know?
Yes.
So I remember asking Mrs. Parks over dinner, how are we doing, Mrs. Parks, with race relations in America today? And she paused for a minute and she said, Mark, we have made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go. And I think that is so true. When you look at the situation today, we still have a long way to go today, but we have made progress.
Yeah.